Yeah, I'm enjoying this paper, not only because it proves me right, but also because it's just a good paper. Not that we had any doubt of my correctness, but now you cannot doubt. We have too much evidence to prove that at least a part of the Dark Ages is fake. Alright, so let's keep going. Oh, let's also do a recap. So, the basic premise of this paper is that there are 300 phantom years essentially added between 600 AD and 700 AD. Now, there's way more years added to the timeline than this, but the reason why I wanted to read this particular paper is because it's coming from an academic source, and it's on the more conservative side of things. Like, I know when you first hear about the Dark Ages being garbage, the reality is that's 1,000 years that have been added to our timeline. Now, that's a good punch in the face for a lot of people, and that probably turns off a lot of people because everybody is so psychologically conditioned to believe the Dark Ages existed, and God help you if you question it, right? You're not allowed to question the almighty academic, throne or whatever, right? That authoritative garbage. But the reality is, once you start to look and dig into a lot of academia's so-called evidence, and I mean really dig in, I mean actually approach the evidence with a scientific mind and an objective attitude. Once you approach the evidence that the mainstream uses to defend, years, for example, 600 AD to 900 AD, what you find is you find all of these scummy practices and underhanded methods that these people employ to back up, the false narrative. And that is what has happened, right? The way that the Dark Ages has been set up in a way that employs nothing but lies. And people accept it, right? Now that's the problem with this whole thing. If the Dark Ages, as it is currently understood, is built upon lies, hypocrisies, duplicates, triplicates, etc., like, why is nobody calling this out? If something like this was comparably happening to you in your real life, if somebody was trying to pull these kind of shenanigans on you in your day-to-day life, you would never fall for it. You would just start choking them out and slapping them. You wouldn't care because you would have to do that to the person because they're lying to you. You would not accept this in your real day-to-day life. So why do we accept it? Not we. Why do people who buy into the Dark Ages accept it in their history? For example, in the first part of this show, in the first part of the paper, we have this doctor pointing out the way that the current academic establishment comes to the conclusions that they do come to with respect to dating archaeological sites. So in this paper alone, one of the main examples is that archaeologists would go and they would, dig up a site, and they would literally be missing the stratigraphy for the 600 to 900 AD era. 300 years of stratigraphy just doesn't exist. There's no evidence for it. So what they do is they look at a completely different site, literally on a different part of the continent, and if they've deemed that the stratigraphy over there in that part is between 600 and 900, they then infer that evidence on the original site, and then they are comfortable stating that, yes, indeed, things took place here between 600 and 900 AD. And then you can ask, of course, where's the evidence? And they have no evidence, but nobody goes that far. Or I should say, they ask for the evidence, and they'll give you the evidence, but did you ever really question that evidence? See, that's where a lot of academia falls apart. They don't question the evidence that's presented to them. They trust that academic authority is not lying, right? They trust that these intelligent people would know what they are talking about, and that's the key to academic control. The perception that people in these high levels of academia are these gods of intellect, right? How could somebody possibly be wrong when they have a little piece of paper that says graduate on it, or they're holding a position high in the the levels of academia, and they're a professor, right? I mean, professors can't possibly be wrong, right? Anybody who studied history knows that is all garbage. right? That history is full, and I mean chock full, of authoritative figures that were 100% wrong and absolutely damaging to every aspect of society. The funny part is that people think today that they're above that. That society today has evolved to a point to where it would be impossible for somebody in an authoritative position to take advantage of you intellectually because you're just so smart. Right? That's the crux, man, and that's the way you get people. Anyway, okay, so the point is that the evidence that the mainstream academia uses to support their claims on dating and ages within the Dark Ages, it's all trash. I mean, they're mixing evidence together. They don't tell you when they don't have evidence, right? That's a good point as well. Okay, all right, let's continue on the paper, and then yeah. This is part 2 of Did the Early Middle Ages Really Exist? By Dr. Hans-Ulrich Niemitz, or Niemitz. Yes, I realize I have the pronunciation skills of a 5-year-old. Just roll with it. Alright. Archaeological research in ceramics encounters big problems for the projected phantom time. 2 quotations. The evolution of half a century is unclear, writes Peter Weissitiel in his 1991 publication about ceramics of the 8th to 13th centuries from settlements of the Main Triangle. 30 years earlier, Werner Harnagel had some troubles with the slow-moving evolution of vessel forms in the 7th, 8th, and 9th centuries at the North Sea coast. It is impossible to find an order in these ceramic vessels. Even to construct a relative chronology still seems to be impossible. Therefore, the ceramic experts try to solve their problems with mathematical and statistical methods. In the same manner as archaeologists, the researcher of ceramics commits a major mistake. A mistake that Gunther P. Fenrig warned of. Independent of the existence of written sources for that period, the medieval archaeologist should try to date his finds with archaeological means. It is not permitted to act in a different way than an archaeologist of ancient history. Thus, archaeologists are not permitted to rely on written sources, especially when the archaeological results and the evidence contradict them, even if generations of historians have worked on those sources. For instance, the framework of the ceramics chronology has been elaborated for 100 years. The researcher correlated each surprising find in accordance with known history. Although more than 100 years ago, in the science of antiquity, we can find amazing words that must have been a warning. For example, the following quotation from 1880 deals with the end of the Merovingian period. But we do miss a reliable milestone of this kind like the one provided by the burial hoard of Durnik. The boundary leads to uncertainty, sometimes until the 9th and even 11th centuries. This shows that each specialist refers to the neighboring discipline to solve his problems of dating, a typical case of circular reasoning. Nobody looks over the whole situation, and therefore nobody is astonished that the same structural problems occur in different disciplines. That is a hugely important paragraph. So that actually sums up tons of archaeology, if I'm honest. Circular reasoning. It is insane how these people date what they date. Because basically what they do is like someone will kind of make up some dates, then someone from a different interdiscipline will kind of come up with their own dates, but then they'll use the other person's dates to kind of correlate their dates, and then somebody else from another discipline will look at these two guys and be like, oh, they've already got it figured out. And then he uses their two false dates to make his date, and they just keep bouncing off one another. Funnily enough, what will then happen is the two original people who were dating things will then look to that third person's date and then use their date for their own stuff. It's just unbelievable, right? Carbon dating and dendrochronology are horrific in this regard. The way anyway, circular reasoning plagues archaeology. So when you guys are looking at dates, when you are trying to figure out the truth, when you are trying to get a grasp on what happened back in the day, and it does not matter what day, by the way, it is important to remember that the researchers who have come up with the dates that you are probably taking as fact, they are fallible, right? They're humans. Even if they were right, they're still fallible, right? You have to remember that. It is important to constantly question what you find or what they found and how they found it. Because what happens very quickly is when you start to question the evidence and you start to dig into how these people came to the conclusions they came to about dates, right? Their evidence is just horrible. I mean, it's just bad. I mean, this would never fly in a court of law. It would never make it in the court. You would be guilty immediately if you were trying to defend yourself with the way archaeologists defend their dates. It's okay. So circular reasoning is bad. All right, moving on. The most common objection to this idea says that methods of scientific dating are infallible and beyond the danger of circular reasoning. Of these methods, the best known are RC14 and dendrochronology. All right, like I just said, awesome. You like that? You like how I have no respect for your time or mine, apparently. As RC14 is now calibrated by and therefore dependent on dendrochronology, it is insignificant for the medieval period. Horst Wilcombe says, we use the C14 method only to correlate a sample of carbon with a certain tree ring. This method, at least for the post-glacial period, has become a relative method. Dendrochronology works because each time period creates typical sequences of tree rings. With the help of overlapping sequences of different trees, it is possible to construct a standard sequence that reaches back centuries for a given region. In this standard sequence, you can find for any suitable wood the corresponding age of growth of this tree. This seems to be a very simple theory. You have to count the tree rings if you want to find the exact year. That's all. But as each individual wood differs from the other and also differs from the standard sequence, dendrochronologists must work with a tremendous mathematical apparatus. Transformation of the ring width into logarithmic differences, preferential treatment of the correlating arithmetic, theoretical derivation of congruent patterns, distance regression of similarity, regional analysis, test function with scope of dating, statistics of sapwood and lost tree rings, distribution of centered differences between dating of art styles, and dendrochronological dating. That is the list of all the mathematical theoretical garbage that a dendrochronologist must employ to come up with a date. That is not science. It's not. What is that? You can't just do that. And look at that. That's what they do. They will take that level of quote unquote science and they will say that whatever comes out of all of those theoretical theorems and trash like that, whatever comes out of it, oh, it must be true. Oh, it sounds so smart. They use big words. Oh, there's like There's like math involved, bro. It has to be like good. Shut up. Like, it's just, see, this is the problem with dating. I'm going to do one whole show on dating one day. Because, man, the dating methods that archaeologists and historians use, and it's okay. But if we're real with one another, I mean, if we're going to be serious, if you know anybody that takes dates that are given by the mainstream and they're backed up by dendrochronology, then that person's insane. That person's crazy. I mean, they're objectively, scientifically insane. You cannot use that as dating. All right, we're moving on. Using this method, one easily commits errors. The following demonstrates this. Researchers erroneously construed the interval between 2000 BC and 500 AD by synchronizing North and Central European oak wood. In one of the synchronizations, the error amounted to 71 years. Not only these 71 years are alarming, but also the error by itself. Methodically, the error was duly kept at 71 years because otherwise the wood, dated before with other methods, would not fit historically. But how was it possible to locate those 71 years in the standard sequence? Are the mathematical methods so flexible? Distrust is necessary even more so because the author of that publication emphasizes that in this case of dating, some unfavorable circumstances accumulated, and such might happen in every laboratory. So basically everything's messed up everywhere. At least they sort of say it there. There is another argument against applying dendrochronology to the Middle Ages. The number of suitable samples of wood which connect antiquity and the Middle Ages is very small. But only a great number of samples would give certainty against the error. For the period of about 380 AD, we only have 3. For the period about 720 AD, only 4 suitable samples of wood. Usually, 50 samples serve for dating. Another argument against dendrochronology consists of its own history. In 1970, Ernst Hallstein, one of the famous and most active dendrochronologists in Germany, proclaimed after 8 years of research a great success. He had solved the problem of bridging the early Middle Ages. Now he could date all samples back to Roman time absolutely and exactly. But he paid a high price, too high as we now know today. He did in fact change his method. Instead of using oak for his oak chronology, he used copper beech wood to fill the gap. But 10 years later, in 1980, it was no longer necessary to use beechwood for the oak chronology. He fortunately had found fitting oak wood, but dates he had defined in 1970 were irrevocable. This is unusual in science, and he did it only reluctantly, as we can see from the following quotation, where he describes his method. The method is unbiased and basically not graphic, because it combines many calculation operations. And the more you have to do more operations, the more the problem of dating is distant from today and from comparable historically secured dates. At borderline, when totally leaving known history, e.g., analyzing 2 completely unknown samples of trees which grew supposedly at the same time, the a priori probability of finding the right date can become so small that only a little chance remains of finding it. For trees of the post-glacial, the probability is approximately 1 in 10,000. These hints show clearly the biggest difficulty of the dendrochronological method. All attempts to get tree ring sequences from timber of the Carolingian times have failed. It is strange, but it proved as extremely difficult to connect the Merovingian wood samples from excavations with the above-mentioned chronologies. Encouraged by an unusually deceptive correlation, as happens from time to time in all fields of knowledge, I believed that I could date the chamber burial of Huffingen at the beginning of the 8th century. After 2 years of intensive studies, I can name at last the right dates and put in order all samples of the early Middle Ages. The misdating of coffins from Huffingen and Oberflacht, which had been calculated very carefully in accordance with the then valid rules, suddenly proved that the statistical methods must be tightened up the more the event is distant from the starting point. That has been neglected hitherto, but is now corrected. Now we don't choose arbitrarily a so-called error probability at the outset, as has been the usual. Now we choose the probability of the correct approach as a function of the observations and available hypothesis. The quality of this test method is, if circumstances permit it, 100 times better and also more certain than the old one. Now that's a quote from Hollenstein, that whole block there. Here we can observe the way Hollenstein changes the method, which reveals even more, i.e. the expectations of waiting colleagues. And those expectations weren't purely academic, as he had to beg for money for his research. As I have been asked time and again to publish my new dates, I feel obliged to give them in a preliminary way and without proof, be it in contradiction with scientific tradition. From this chronologically arranged summary, one cannot deduce how, after many futile tests, the right correlation has been found. And it still remains a process of searching, which is not altered by the fact that we use computers. Holstein reports about bridging the critical period of the 8th century. There simply exists no sample of wood. Quote, in this moment, Dr. Jensen discovered on the Christenberg near Marburg Lawn a well from the Carolingian times, whose heavy square timbers provided a sequence of 339 years. Although this wood of red beech, a type of wood with occasional tendency to missing rings, still this Marburg sequence coincides in the decisive period of the 7th, 8th, and 9th centuries. With the other sequences, so early medieval wood samples cannot be regarded as firmly dated. And that's Hollenstein again. In brief, Hollenstein says that he, being in trouble, took a piece of wood predated by historians to fill his gap. This cannot be called archaeological evidence. And that would be correct. We do not do science like that. If we find any archaeologist or historian using these kind of fraudulent methodologies to prove the timeline, you can then and there discard all of that timeline. That is not how we do science. That we don't do it like that. If you don't have the solid, provable scientific evidence to make the claim of a particular date, you shut up. You don't say anything. You don't just look to the mainstream and be like, oh, I better conform to that, otherwise I'll get fired. No, you shut up and you keep looking. The problem is archaeologists and historians do not do this, right? They use this twisted evidence. They make up evidence. They just create whatever they feel feels scientific, and then they throw it into their theory, and they're like, oh yeah, that backs up that dating. That's not how we do it, all right? Archaeology and historians are lying to us, and the proof is right there. If you think these years existed, you have to somehow account for this. You have to account for this. What's the excuse? How are you allowing this to exist in your life? How are you allowing this kind of evidence to drive your belief system of a particular period in time? If you are laying the claim that the years 600 AD to 900 AD exists in real time, You have to account for everything that was just said there, and you have to account for it scientifically, right? And of course, we know in reality, there is no accounting for it. It's all garbage. All right, let's keep going. A good scientist in trouble usually sends out signals for help, sometimes unconsciously, and so does Hallstein. After listing his tree ring dates secured by what he terms the oldest chronological documented year-by-year dates, he says, "It is good to know that the West German oak chronology for nearly 1,000 years is exactly under control, year by year. Going back to the earlier millennia, the missing documentary frame has to be substituted by an essentially tightened correlation." We could express this statement as thus: it is very difficult to point out the years before 1000 AD because we do not have any dates supported by written documents. Why not quote more recent test results after 1980? A Hamburg dendrochronologist responded to my request for recent literature in December 1994. Today, sequences and dates are no longer published because there exists the danger of abuse. Hobby dendrochronologists earned money by dating, for example, timbers of the houses for private clients with unreliable methods. So laboratories in Europe and worldwide exchange their dates without publishing them. Like, that's amazing. The fact that that ever existed at all within the scientific community, that kind of a lockdown, that is not how you do science. You let your results speak for themselves, and if somebody can prove them wrong, especially these hobbyists, we have no reason to believe that the hobbyists are technically wrong, right? They're doing the same work that the mainstream is doing, right? They're all lying to each other. And also, we don't even know who's lying anymore because we can't even see a lot of the results. And that apparently still goes on today, by the way. And in fact, I realize that this paper is from the mid-90s, but one of the things we can get out of this is perspective, right? So this kind of stuff was already going on, in the 90s. Right? The problems were glaring even back then, and the corruption was widespread even back then. And if you don't think that's going on now, right, holy crap, open your eyes on that. That's okay. Let's keep moving. After a cursory glance over the riddles and research problems, two great questions remain. How was it possible to insert this phantom time into history? Or, asked in a provocative manner, who, and when, and how, and why, falsified history by adding 300 years? And the second question, how can it be possible to discuss the thesis of the phantom time in the scientific community without being discriminated against as some von Daniken of the Middle Ages? Both questions are more closely connected than you might assume at first thought. Now, of course, in present day today, the 2020s or whatever time you're listening to this, that's, 2023. We are still there. I mean, in fact, the more you question history nowadays, I mean, you're essentially an insane loony bin person, right? You are not allowed to bring any of the new scientific discoveries and present them to the mainstream in a way that says, hey, look, you might have made an error in your chronological dating. You might have to change your dates. Here's the science. Of course, the second you try to say that to the mainstream, you are instantly ridiculed, you are instantly a conspiracy theorist, and you are instantly discarded by the mainstream, right? And we see that all the time. We see that on YouTube all the time. Go look at comments of people who are pointing out phantom time periods, right? Go look at the comments from mainstream people. Those people have been psychologically conditioned to dogpile on ideas that contradict whatever mainstream ideology has been implanted in them in their lives. And the psychology happens immediately. It's an instant trigger, right? That word trigger is a legitimate term psychologically, right? You could trigger people subconsciously by showing them ideologies, and it happens all the time. right? If you need any science to prove that, just look at what we see here now in social media. It's insane. It's absolutely crazy. And that is not how we do science. All right, now I'm annoyed. So we're going to call it here. We'll make this 3 parts. I'll finish it in the next video. But what we've seen just here in this section of this paper is that we're calling out the garbage of dendrochronology, right? I mean, the way dendrochronology is done, that's science, quote unquote, immediately invalidates any outcome given by that process. Dendrochronology is not a real dating method. All right, and I'm going to make a show on that later to really go through the details. But just look it up. I mean, it takes 2 seconds to see how poor dendrochronology is with respect to dating anything. Right? So here at least we find that the scientists in the mainstream at some point, a couple of them, one dude, specifically here at least, he's saying that, hey, look, anywhere between 0 and 1000 AD, the reality is we have no conclusive way to prove that any tree rings were created during that time period. So what that means is that anybody using dendrochronology to try to date 600 AD to 900 AD, it doesn't work. It's impossible, and it is impossible. We don't have the information to calibrate dendrochronology like that. Don't bother trying to come at me with radiocarbon dating, because we also proved and talked about how radiocarbon dating utilizes mainstream historical chronology to calibrate itself with respect to dendrochronology, right? It's just circular reasoning. It does not work. All right, we'll continue and finish this paper in the next video, because now I am so irritated at mainstream garbage. It's just stupid.